In 1916, these are the lyrics to one of the most popular songs in the United States. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. Read through them.
10 million soldiers to the war have gone, who may never return again. 10 million mothers' hearts must break for the one who died in vain. Heads bowed down in sorrow in her lonely years, I heard a mother murmur through her tears, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier, I brought him up to be my pride and joy, who dared to place a musket on his shoulder, to shoot some other mother's darling boy. Let nations operate their future troubles, it's time to lay the sword and gun away. There'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. What victory can cheer a mother's heart when she looks at her blighted home? What victory can bring her back all she cares to call her own? Let each mother answer in the years to be, remember that my boy belongs to me. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier, I brought him up to be my pride and joy, who dared to place a musket on his shoulder, to shoot some other mother's darling boy. Let nations operate their future troubles, it's time to lay the sword and gun away. There'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier, I brought him up to be my pride and joy, who dared to place a musket on his shoulder, to shoot some other mother's darling boy. Let nations arbitrate their future troubles, it's time to lay the sword and gun away. There'd be no war today if mothers all would say, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier.
By 1917, this was one of the most popular songs in the United States. Grab your gun, kill the Hun. Question is, what caused such a rapid change in public opinion? From we didn't want to be involved to jump in and defeat Germany. This is the beginnings of World War I.
Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Take it on the run, on the run, on the run. Hear them calling you and me, every son of liberty. Hurry right away, no delay, go today. Make your daddy glad to have had such a lad. Tell your sweetheart not to pine, to be proud her boy's in line. Over there, send the word over there, that the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drums rum-tumming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there, over there. over there. Send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming. The drums coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer. Send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there. Johnny, get your gun, get your gun, get your gun. Johnny, show the Hun you're a son of a gun. Hoist the flag and let her fly. Yankee doodle do or die. Pack your little kit, show your grit, do your bit. Yankees to the ranks from the towns and the tanks. Make your mother proud of you and the old red, white, and blue. Over there, send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drum coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there. Over there, send the word over there. That the Yanks are coming, the Yanks are coming, the drum coming everywhere. So prepare, say a prayer, send the word to beware. We'll be over, we're coming over, and we won't come back till it's over there.
Even though World War I had started in Europe in 1914, public opinion in the United States was that it wasn't our war. We wanted to stay neutral. Europe was far away. It didn't threaten us. War was expensive. We didn't want to have to spend the money. And there was also the issue that we had those millions of immigrants who had come into the United States around 1900 from all different countries. Some of those countries of their origin were at war. And so which side would we go into if we entered the war? Would we go in with Germany, or would we go in with Great Britain and France? Public opinion was divided, partially because of all the immigrants who were loyal to their home country. World War I had broken out in Europe in 1914. Because the various nations of Europe had secret mutual assistance treaties, it happened like a domino effect. It started over the assassination in Serbia of Crown Prince of the Austro-Hungary Empire. Well, then Austro-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Serbia had one of these treaties with Russia. So Russia came in on the Serbian side. Well, when Russia came in, that meant that Austria came in for Germany. And so it was like a domino effect as each of the countries took sides. Britain and France came in on the side of Russia, and therefore you had World War I. Because remember, all of these European countries have colonies around the world. And so while the primary fighting might have been in Europe, the war also existed around the world because of all those different colonies. The United States followed its traditional foreign policy about European wars that we didn't want to be involved. We declared neutrality. And under the laws of neutrality, traditionally, that meant that neutral shipping was free to trade with both sides in the war. However, the Germans did not want us trading with England and France, and England and France did not want us trading with Germany, and so we kind of got caught in the middle, and our neutrality was abused by both sides. The tradition was that a neutral ship could be stopped, searched, and if it was not carrying war materials, then it could be free to sail on. But new technology made that a problem. Now, the United States and the corporations saw a great opportunity to make money by selling to both sides, but particularly to England and France, who would ultimately become our allies. And so the assistance to England and France was more than trade with Germany. And this the Germans saw as helping their enemies with the war. England in particular, being an island, needed to get supplies from outside. They had the most powerful navy in the world on the surface, and therefore they could help protect American shipping. And they actively recruited U.S. help in their war effort. American shipping was being attacked, however, by a new technology called the submarine. Because the British Navy was the most powerful on the seas, Germany resorted to submarine warfare. And in 1917, they began what they call unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning that they would shoot at any ship, no matter what. Now, again, the traditional principles of naval warfare were that you stopped a ship, you inspected it. If it didn't have war material on it, you let it go onto its port. But that kind of defeats the purpose of a submarine, being silent and stealthy. And so the Germans couldn't risk surfacing and commanding a ship to stop because they might get blown out of the water. And so they began to attack any shipping that wasn't their own. And they sunk hundreds of American ships, even though we were neutral. They even sunk passenger liners like the Lusitania, which was sailing off the Irish coast, and it was torpedoed. It sank within 15 minutes and killed over 1,200 people, civilians. Well, this was a gross violation of traditional rules of warfare. And yet to the Germans, this was necessary because their surface fleet could not control the shipping. Although this unrestricted submarine warfare and the sinking of the passenger ship Lusitania were happening, the American people were still not ready to go to war. In the presidential election of 1916, President Wilson was running for re-election, and he ran on an anti-war platform, that he, as president, had kept us out of the war, He had steered clear of all of the problems of international war. In fact, his slogan in that campaign was, "He kept us out of war." And that resounded with American people, and he was reelected. Following his reelection, however, conditions began to change. For one thing, the Russians, who had been on the French and British side, experienced the Bolshevik Revolution, the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II, and once the Bolsheviks, the communists, took over Russia, they made a separate peace treaty with Germany. And so Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, pulled out of World War I. And that left England and France kind of fighting on their own. After diplomatic efforts had gotten the Germans to temporarily stop their unrestricted submarine warfare after the sinking of the Lusitania, the war itself was not going well, and so the Germans started using unrestricted submarine warfare again and sailing the submarines off of the east coast of the United States and attacking American ships close to the United States. Then Germany made a huge diplomatic mistake. The United States and Mexico were not on good terms. President Wilson had sent American troops into Mexico twice, trying to intervene in their internal politics. The Germans saw this and thought that maybe they could recruit Mexico to come into World War I on their side. So the Foreign Secretary, a man named Zimmerman, sent a telegram to the Mexican government saying that if they would, in the event that the United States declared war on Germany, that Mexico should come into the war on the German side. And when they won, Mexico would get back all of the land the United States had taken from them, including Texas and California. And this was the German diplomatic proposal to Mexico. However, what the Germans didn't realize when they sent this in the form of a telegram, it's called either the Zimmerman Note or the Zimmerman Telegram, was that the central transmitting station for all telegraph traffic moving from Europe to the Americas was through London. The British intercepted this proposal, the so-called Zimmerman Note, and they immediately forwarded it to the United States. This outraged the American people and the American government. And so the Zimmerman Note proved a tipping point that helped to bring the United States into World War I. President Wilson immediately broke off diplomatic relations with Germany, and then in a speech to Congress, he outlined why he believed the United States needed to enter the war and declare war on Germany. Remember that Wilson is a progressive, meaning he believes that mankind is progressing towards a more civilized state. And yet war is the most uncivilized thing there is. But his reasons for wanting to enter World War I were, number one, to make the world safe for democracy. His vision of the world after the war was one of a democratic republic like the United States, not monarchies, not dictatorships. Make the world safe for democracy. He also said that this would be the war to end all wars, that once we won this war, we would set up a whole new world order, which would prevent wars in the future. He went to Congress and got a declaration of war against Germany, and the United States entered World War I in 1917. Immediately, the government began to put out anti-German propaganda, depicting the Germans as bloodthirsty savages. Here, a cartoon of them bayoneting a baby. This was a calculated propaganda campaign on the part of the U.S. government to raise fear and anger at Germany. The government made a conscious effort to try to involve all citizens, whether they were in the military service or at home, in helping to crush the menace of the seas, unrestricted submarine warfare. The federal government feared spies and saboteurs, particularly from all of those immigrants who had come here from the countries that were now our enemies. And so they put absolute restrictions on people who they thought might be dangerous. They trampled all over their civil liberties, for example. They passed one law called the Sedition Act that basically said you could not speak out in opposition to the war, a clear violation of freedom of speech. They passed laws that allowed them to arrest people for what might be anti-war activities.
Immediately after the U.S. had declared war, local governments, civic organizations, and even ordinary citizens began an attack on German Americans and their culture.
There are children who are instructed by their teachers to cut German songs out of the music books that they use in their classrooms. There is a public Stein-breaking fest at one point to keep people from drinking German beer. There's even in one town in Ohio a really gruesome slaughter of German dog breeds. But it's important not to let these ridiculous stories to overshadow what is really a wholesale destruction of an ethnic culture in the United States.
Germans were pressured to stop playing German music, to stop going to German plays. And when I say Germans, I mean German Americans whose ancestors might have been in this country since before the Revolution.
The anti-German hysteria even extended to the federal government. The CPI published an article with tips on how to identify people who were pro-German. The president issued a decree that made any German living in the United States register as an enemy alien. Almost 500,000 men and women were photographed, fingerprinted, and interrogated about their loyalty to the United States. The program was administered by a 22-year-old member of the Department of Justice, J. Edgar Hoover. By the fall, a new series of camps capable of housing thousands of people had sprung up in Utah, Georgia, and North Carolina. Not to train new recruits, but to imprison anyone that the government considered a threat to its security.
There was tremendous pressure on new immigrants to conform, to have American flags, to sing American songs. We welcomed you here. Now you're here, you're with us, and you're only with us.
To help finance the war, the government began to push for the U.S. citizens to buy what were called Liberty bonds. These were basically government IOUs that paid interest. And they even had a program where you could buy a bond for a few cents a day or a week, and ultimately it would add up to a whole Liberty bond. Now, this was a new concept for most Americans, this concept of investing savings in a money-making financial instrument. The vast majority of Americans had never invested in anything except maybe a piece of land. But this concept of investing your money and earning interest on it was something brand new to most Americans. And so this push by the federal government for the public to buy Liberty bonds to help finance the war introduces millions of Americans for the first time to the concept of investing in a financial instrument to earn interest. World War I, before the United States entered, had come down to pretty much a stalemate. And the method of war was primarily what was called trench warfare. There were literally trenches dug all across Europe. And the troops from one side would be in their trenches, the troops from the other side would be in their trenches. And the only way that you could really get at each other was through a frontal assault or charge. But new technology had made this absolutely deadly, particularly the introduction of the machine gun to the battlefield. Now, when a mass of men charged, like they had in warfare since the beginning of warfare, the machine gun could just mow them down. The Germans began to use poison gas that they would release in hopes that it would go over and settle in the trenches of the Allies. The introduction of the airplane. Remember, the first flight was only in 1907. So this is a brand new technology, and they don't know quite how to use it in war. Originally, it started off, they were just doing reconnaissance. They would fly over the enemy position and see what the troop movement was, and then go back and report. Now, how it became a weapons platform, I don't know, but my kind of twisted imagination goes something like this. These spy planes are flying over enemy territory, and all of a sudden, a German plane and a British plane see each other flying. And one side pulls out their revolver and starts shooting at the other plane. Well, the other pilot says, whoa, if they're going to shoot at me, I guess I better get some armament up here too. And so he went back and he got somebody to mount a machine gun on the front of his plane, but there was no remote control. He had to have the machine gun right in front of him where he could reach up and pull the trigger. Problem was that he could blow off his propeller doing that, until a Belgian scientist made a new mechanical technology that timed the shots from the mounted machine gun to shoot through the spinning propellers. And then I'm sure that somebody took some kind of a little bomb or something up and flew over and dropped it. But anyway, the airplane went from reconnaissance to being a weapons platform in World War I. Another new technology was called the tank. This was originally an armored personnel carrier to help troops get across no man's land from their trenches to the enemy trenches. But very quickly, they began to mount weapons on this new personnel carrier, and therefore it also became a weapons platform. But all of these new technologies made World War I absolutely deadly. At home, Wilson wanted to harness the power of American industry to provide the material to fight the war. And so Congress created the War Industries Board. And Wilson appointed a head of this. And basically what the War Industries Board did was it took over all of American industry. It decided who would get what raw materials and how much. It decided which factories would make what. So you might have the car factories stopping the making of cars and start making airplane engines. You had clothing factories that were making uniforms rather than clothing. Piano companies who were using the wire that they used in pianos, but this time to make airplane wings. And so basically the War Industries Board took over the manufacturing industries of the United States. Now, they did pay out of the government funds for these materials. So the owners of the industries were making a nice profit. However, the War Industries Board did have the power to put a cap on how much a company could charge for what they made. And usually that cap was pretty generous. What was not so generous was the ending of the workers' compensation. It put a cap on what a worker could be paid. And so while the owners of the factories were making some nice profits, the workers were not sharing in those profits. When the men began to join the military or be drafted into service in the military, that left all kinds of jobs behind. Somebody had to do those jobs. And so women went to work in the war industries, taking up the jobs that had been exclusively male up until that point. For some women, this became a very liberating experience, earning their own money, being that kind of independent, self-sufficient person. And so some of these women would like that experience so much that they didn't want to give it up after the war was over. I mentioned the government fanning the flames of anti-Germany. Well, this resulted in a lot of cases in the American citizens who might have German names either having to change their name or having to carry papers proving that they were an American. An intolerance against hyphenated Americans, if you will, German Americans, Czech Americans, whatever. And so, for instance, here are the credentials of a woman who was born in Kansas, had married a man with a German name, and now she had to carry all these documents with her wherever she went to prove that she was not a spy. Also on the home front, the federal government took over the administration of food supplies. It ended up, we had to feed not just the American troops, but most of the Allied troops as well. And so the Food Administration was set up. It set up rationing, limiting the amount of food that civilians could get. It also encouraged civilians to produce their own food. One of these things that the good civilian at home could do to help win the war, and it was a very concerted effort by the government to make people feel like they were contributing to the war effort. But one of the ways you could do that was by planting what was called a victory garden. In other words, in your own backyard, go out and plant food, tomatoes or potatoes or corn or whatever. So you didn't have to buy it at the store. So you could grow your own, and that meant that food that was produced commercially would be available to send to the troops. And so grow your own vegetables in your victory garden. That is a way you can contribute as a civilian to winning the war. I mentioned how the new technologies made this war absolutely devastating. It's estimated that 5 million Allied troops were killed. Now, only about 500,000 of those were Americans. 8.5 million on the German side died. It virtually wiped out a generation of men in Europe. Even before the war had included the United States, Woodrow Wilson had been trying to be the mediator to bring an end to the war. He had tried to negotiate before the United States ever declared war. And the Zimmerman telegram was kind of the last straw. It kind of made him realize he was not going to be able to end the war diplomatically. But that did not stop him from having a post-war vision. And his post-war vision was outlined in what became known as Wilson's 14 points. This was an outline of a new world, of a world where you had peace without victory, as he put it. And so the 14 points became a very big part of the diplomatic solutions at the end of the war. As too often happens, many of Wilson's 14 points looked back at what had caused this war, not looking forward to what might cause the next one. For example, no secret agreements. He said that all the world should agree to open covenants openly arrived at. Well, remember, it was those secret agreements that had caused the domino effect of bringing country after country into the war. Free navigation of all the seas. Again, the attacking of neutral ships. He's addressing things that got us into this war. However, he was being progressive when he talked about ending all economic barriers between countries. that is free trade. And that was certainly not the case, not the situation at this time diplomatically. Remember the restrictions, the tariffs that created barriers to trade. Part of what had caused World War I was an arms race. Who could develop the biggest, newest, and baddest weapons? And that had not prevented the war. And so Wilson was proposing, hey, why don't we try arms reduction as a way of preventing future wars? And then other parts of it were just about the immediate solutions to what would happen after the World War I. Many of Wilson's 14 points turned out to be kind of like housekeeping, self-determination for countries and stuff like that. But number 14 became a biggie. He wanted to establish a League of Nations where nations could come together and diplomatically solve their problems without having to go to war. Remember, his primary goal here is not just to end World War I, but also to prevent future wars from happening. And so the League of Nations he sees as a way of having countries talk out their differences rather than fight them out. While American soldiers were important in turning the tide of war, it was really American manufacturing that tipped the scales in favor of the Allies. American manufacturing poured weapons, poured food onto the battlefields, and the war turned against Germany. And so Germany asked for terms. They signed an armistice saying that they're going to stop fighting, that they surrendered. And thus the fighting stopped. But when the fighting on the battlefield stopped, it started among the Allies, who were gathering to put together a peace treaty. Because the war had been fought primarily on French soil, the French wanted Germany punished. They wanted Germany destroyed. The British were not quite as insistent on that, but they still wanted some harsh measures as part of Germany's punishment. Wilson in the United States, however, remember, he was saying peace without victory. He was not that interested in punishing Germany, but he recognized that he had to compromise and go along with many of the things the French and the British wanted.
The Great War was over. On the 11th of November 1918, an armistice had been signed. In Britain and France, the survivors celebrated victory, the return of peace, and the end of bloodshed. They'd left behind the nightmare lands of death and destruction created by 4 years of war. The cost of those years was almost beyond imagination, but somehow, somewhere, that cost would have to be counted. And the defeated would have to pay the price of peace. To the west of Paris stands the great palace of Versailles. It was here that the peace treaty with Germany would eventually be signed. But before that could happen, much had to be decided. In January 1919, 2 months after the armistice, the delegates of the victorious powers arrived in Paris for the peace conference to draw up the terms to be offered to the defeated countries. In all, the representatives of 27 nations attended that conference. But of all the statesmen who came to Paris to settle the peace, the most important were President Wilson of the United States, Georges Clemenceau, the French Premier, and Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Britain. Each had very different ideas of what to do about the central problem of Germany. Clemenceau, like most Frenchmen, knew what he wanted out of the peace: revenge, reparations for the damage the French had suffered, and guarantees that a similar war would never, could never happen again. The idea that Germany should be let off lightly would have seemed sheer madness to Frenchmen who'd seen the effects of the German war machine on their own country. In order that scenes like this could never happen again, they wanted a Germany stripped of her wealth and armed forces. In contrast, Woodrow Wilson appeared to promise a just and lasting peace, not punishment. Europe acclaimed him as the great and good man from the New World. This was because his 14 points seemed to promise a new moral order in international affairs. No more secret diplomacy, reduction in armaments, and a League of Nations to protect all countries from aggression. He didn't want revenge as the French did, but there was no question that Germany should get off scot-free. But while Wilson was planning the future of Europe, Americans were rapidly losing interest as their boys came back home. They wanted a peace that wouldn't involve them in European affairs. Surprisingly, it was Lloyd George who fought most strongly for German interests at Versailles. Behind him was a public elated by victory, but eager for revenge. The Prime Minister appeared to share their opinion, but really had no time for those who wanted to destroy Germany. What mattered to him was that Germany should be made stable and allowed to recover her strength as a trading partner. This was the kind of Germany he feared, a land of miserable refugees, poverty, homelessness and starvation. All conditions likely to provide a perfect breeding ground for the new disease from the East, communism. In Berlin, his fears had already been realized. A communist revolt had broken out there in early January. While the leaders tried to rouse the mass of the people, armed communists occupied key public buildings. This was a direct challenge to Ebert, acting president of the new German government. He had to turn for support to army generals who brought in bands of ex-soldiers and turned them loose on the communists. Berlin briefly became a battlefield. Within a week, the revolt was crushed. Communist leaders were rounded up and some brutally murdered. Post-war politics in Germany were off to a bloody start. Meanwhile, in Paris, whilst the German government was squashing the threat to its own existence, the Allied leaders were arguing their way over the whole future of the German people. Under their hands, the map of Europe was drawn and redrawn again. At last, after more than 3 months of discussion, they presented the terms of their treaty to the Germans. Germany lost land in the east, the west, and the north. In the east, the most important of those losses was the wide strip of territory given to the newly independent Poland, separating East Prussia from the rest of Germany. While on the west, France took back the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, and was also given the right to mine coal in the Saar, an area placed under League of Nations control for 15 years. To protect France, Germany was forbidden to station soldiers in the Rhineland, an area which was to be occupied by Allied troops until 1935. It was not only the loss of territory which Germany resented, but also the fact that Czechoslovakia and Poland now contained large numbers of Germans. And as if to add insult to injury, the treaty forbade German-speaking Austria to unite with Germany. Her fortifications were to be destroyed. Her army was to be reduced to 100,000 men. No air force, no submarines, and to accept blame for starting the war and pay reparations. In protest at Scapa Flow, the British naval base, the Germans scuttled their fleet rather than hand it over to the Allies. It was a last defiant gesture. Germany would have to agree to the terms. She was in no position to restart the war. So, in the high summer of 1919, the German delegates were brought to the Great Hall of Mirrors at Versailles to sign the peace treaty. It was a compromise peace that satisfied not even one single Allied leader, and predictably the Germans loathed it.
Part of the reason Germany had signed the armistice and surrendered was that they believed that Wilson's 14 points would be the basis for the final treaty, which became known as the Treaty of Versailles. However, virtually none of Wilson's 14 points were included in the Treaty of Versailles. Only one, the League of Nations. All the rest of his 14 points were pretty much ignored. And the Treaty of Versailles was much more punishing of Germany than the Germans had expected based on the 14 points. So when Germany saw what their punishment in the Treaty of Versailles, they felt like they had been betrayed, that they had been hung out for the wolves to devour. And so the German people hated the Treaty of Versailles, and it would become one of the major points that will help the rise of Adolf Hitler and help bring about World War II. But the Treaty of Versailles, and particularly the Versailles and the League of Nations, created controversy here at home. As the American soldiers came home from the war, the Treaty of Versailles came to the Senate. And many senators felt like that by agreeing to that treaty and agreeing to a League of Nations, that the United States was giving up its power, its sovereignty. It was going to let other countries tell us what we could and could not do, and that was not acceptable. So basically, in the Senate, they tried to cripple the Treaty of Versailles. They refused to sign the treaty as long as the League of Nations was in it. And so basically, the Senate killed American approval of that treaty. Technically, we would still be at war with Germany until the 1930s. In the view of many Americans, perhaps most Americans, we had had enough international entanglement by being involved in World War I. We just wanted to take care of ourselves. And many people saw the League of Nations as the United States making a commitment to being involved in and future international adventures. And that was not acceptable. So as a result, the Treaty of Versailles left Europe very unsettled, as Germany and its allies hated the treaty and despised the people who forced them to accept it. Meanwhile, as this cartoon shows, the United States, at least the people of the United States, were blissfully unaware of all of the controversy that was happening because of the treaty in Europe. For the United States, the results of World War II were several. First of all, we became a world power. We were still not viewed as equal to France and England, but we were in the ball game. Secondly, we emerged as a creditor nation. We had loaned money to the Allied countries, and so those Allied countries now owed the United States money. We had seen the complete ignoring of laissez-faire as the government intervened in the economy. And this had worked so well in winning the war that many Americans were reluctant to go back to laissez-faire. War spending stimulated the economy. People made a lot of money. At least the owners of the corporations, the management of the corporations, the workers, not so much. And finally, it exposed many in the United States to a new set of morals, whether it be the soldiers who had been in France and had seen a new set of standards, or whether it had been just the beginnings of questioning the strict Victorian morals, because who knows, you might die tomorrow kind of attitude. Those began to break down. And finally, it ended progressivism. Now, there were still progressives, and they still wanted to bring about reform. But as a national political movement, progressivism was killed by World War I.
So America watches World War I from 1914 to April of 1917. And people ask why. Why doesn't America get involved immediately? And American politicians are petrified of being drawn into a foreign war and fighting for foreign ends.
Remember, the United States is a nation of immigrants. People came here to avoid war in Europe.
The Americans had, from the very beginning, an official policy of neutrality. But neutrality never meant indifference or apathy.
Even though we're saying we don't want to involve ourselves, we certainly were sympathetic in trying to help and aid that cause in ways that the Germans saw as being destructive to their war aims. So in all those ways, the Wilson administration is walking a tightrope.
Woodrow Wilson, after all, runs for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." And yet, within a year after winning that election, that very same president is declaring war on the Germans.
Ultimately, the triggering event that brings us into the war is Germany's decision to revive unrestricted submarine warfare.
Added to that, the Germans had managed in a particularly ham-fisted way to try and recruit the Mexicans to come in on their side if America entered the war. And they had offered to return to the Mexicans all the lands they had lost in the 19th century to the US, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. The Germans sent this offer to the Mexicans by telegram, Western Union, of all things. Only what they didn't realize was the Western Union office was in London. And so the British captured the telegram and promptly sent it to the US and released it in public. And that angered the American people so much that, combined with unrestricted submarine warfare, Wilson felt that he had to take the US into the war against Germany and Austro-Hungary. When America entered the conflict, it changed the war. Although not as much as everybody expected, because just as America was entering the war, Russia was dropping out.
Now, it's a race. As Russia is leaving the war, can the United States get enough troops in to tilt that scale in favor of the Allies?
They brought in the men, the materiel, and the resources that these Allies needed desperately.
The French and the British were suffering a sense that the war was stalemated, that defeat might be coming, and the American commitment was a real shot in the arm for both political leaders and for ordinary soldiers in the trenches.
Prior to the outbreak of World War I, America was recognized as a strong young nation. By joining with the Allies and really helping to bring about the end of the war, we positioned ourselves as one of the world powers for the rest of the century.